Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is this big march that took place last week. Actually, it was two big marches. It was a march that, from what I understand, there were actually more people opposed to the march. And I want to talk a little bit about this with the Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo. She is an interesting person. She has written, as you can see if you on video, a book called The Queer Evangelist. She's a minister in the United Church. She was a MLA, a minister, MPP, a member of provincial parliament, and she actually was a minister at a church in the area in West Toronto that I used to live in. And I went and heard her speak once, or did a sermon once, a long time ago. She performed Canada's first legalized marriage, and she's passed more LGBTQ plus bills into law than anyone else in Canadian history, and she has the Order of Canada. Dr. Cheri DiNovo, welcome to the show.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Brian.
My pleasure. Yeah. So let's talk about this issue last week, which was really about sort of support for or against trans people. Is that correct?
Yes. Actually, it actually was against our laws, because there are laws that I and many others have worked for over the years to get passed, like putting trans rights into our human rights code in Ontario. That was in 2012. Then it spread across the country. And of course, the feds brought it in as well. So it's now the law across Canada. And that's gender identity and gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code. And it covers children. So there's that. Also passed a bill banning conversion therapy, trying to turn queer kids straight. That was in 2015. And again, worked with the federal government on that, and they passed that too. So these are bills protecting children from exactly this kind of outpouring of bigotry, which is what it is. It has nothing to do with faith, and has nothing to do with science, and has nothing to do with the safety of children. So, this so-called million-person march, I doubt that they got half that, was met with the very righteous, I think, outpouring of support and love for our children who are coming out as trans or non-binary when they're children. This has been happening for decades. It's been happening since people were around on this planet, but now it's been happening with the support of our medical establishment, our psychological establishment, and certainly most progressive people in faith, of all faiths. So the fact that, some of the tweets that I received, like there are no such thing as trans children, this is nonsense. there are trans people in the Bible, for heaven's sakes. And so...
hold it. There's trans people in the Bible?
Yeah, called eunuchs back then. And Jesus says in Matthew 19:12, some are born that way. I always say 2,000 years before Lady Gaga, he said that. He said, some are made that way by others, clearly forcibly castrated in those days for reasons, usually to protect harems. But some were born that way. What does he mean? If anything, he's talking about people who are not born interested in heterosexual marriage, born different sexually. So there's that. It's right in Matthew. Check it out. And
what's the verse again?
Matthew 19:12. People, it gets lost because it comes just after divorce, the prescription against divorce. So at any rate, to get back to the march and what spawned it, it's simply a misunderstanding, lack of education about sexuality generally, and what trans folk are and have always been. And definitely it's counter to our laws. So this was an outpouring of people defending the law, in fact, and defending our human rights, especially the rights of children. I've said, by way of making it a little clearer for people who maybe aren't trans and aren't, queer, how would you like it if your teachers, for example, told your parents about buying condoms or going to seek the birth control pill when you were a teenager? Or, how would you feel about that? This is how trans children, and it's much worse for trans children because they're the subject to bullying. They have a much higher suicide rate than straight children, and much higher homelessness rate. People turf them out of their homes, and I can't, at any rate, so it's much worse for them to be outed to their parents who may not be supportive of what they're going through. So so this is about the rights of children as well, not even just trans children. It's the right of children and our teenagers to privacy.
So anyway, if you could for a second, what's the argument on the other side that teachers should tell parents and parents have a right to know? Is that what the argument on the other side is?
Yes, and it has been put into law in New Brunswick, for example. And of course, we're all privy to the rise in anti-trans legislation that's coming out of the United States in various states. So that's commonplace down there, Republican-run states. It is not up here. We've heard Lecce talking about possibly introducing it. I can tell you he will be met with an enormous challenge, not only from across the aisle, but from within his own ranks. In fact, November 20th, which is Trans Day of Remembrance, by law, the entire legislature before the question period has to stand for a moment of silence in honor of those trans folk the year before who died violently, either by their own hand or by others. There's always hundreds. And that's a law I passed. It was the last law I got passed under the LGBTQ umbrella just before I left politics in 2017. And I'll be there and we'll be watching as the Conservatives stand for a moment of silence. So I know even within their own ranks, there's resistance to this. I know there are members in the Conservative Party that are elected that have LGBTQ children, that have trans children, that have lived through this with their own children. So anyway, I doubt very much whether he's going to get traction. Certainly all of the teachers at the counter demonstration that I spoke at, all of them refused to out children, including the Ontario English Catholic teachers. So nobody's going to do that. Nobody's going to follow through, even if he does manage to do it. And there would be a charter challenge. And certainly there would be a challenge from individuals.
And so this million person march or whatever it was, who's behind it? Is it right-wing evangelical Christians? Is it conservatives? Who is it that's behind it?
It looks similar to the people that resisted the new physical education program that it took the Liberal government a long time to bring in, affectionately called the sex ed program. There was a lot of resistance to that from the religious right, from all religions on the right wing of the spectrum. And that was simply because at heart, in the new curriculum, it says that it's okay to be LGBTQ. And in fact, another bill that we jointly passed when I was in government was that every high school needs a gay-straight alliance. Every high school needs a support group for queer kids. And so that passed too. So there are support groups for a reason in high school for children that are coming out in various ways. So at any rate, it was a resistance to that back then. And it's the same people. There's also, I noticed some, the People's Party signs were there. I also noticed some convoy people there. But mainly and mostly it's people who I think really lack the education about what, first of all, the laws are in this country. Second of all, what children need and how dangerous it is to out them to parents who may not be supportive.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Cheri DiNovo. We're chatting about, Cheri DiNovo. We're talking about this trans march, both pro and con, or con and pro, that occurred, this big controversy last week, where, from what I understand, there were actually more people that came out to support trans rights in the marches than there were people that were asking the government to put in place regulations, laws that oblige teachers to inform parents when children indicated they might be trans. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Dr. Cheri DiNovo. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. The topic tonight is trans, people that are against and people who are for. This march last week that took place, where supposedly there were 1 million people that were marching against trans rights and asking for teachers to have an obligation to tell parents when children were indicating they might be trans. And then, from what I understand, even more people that showed up to object to that. And my guest is the Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo. She is a former member of the provincial legislature. She was in government. She passed numerous different LGBTQ plus laws, and she's now the queer evangelist. And we'll have to talk about her book about that a little bit. Dr. DiNovo, I wonder if you could take a step back for a second. I interviewed someone from the United States in the legal profession on this topic who said, you know, Brian, the right has lost this war against gay marriage, and they're upset, but they realize that the population has moved such that they can't win it again. And so therefore they picked two new topics, drag queens and trans, as the topics, because, you know, everyone knew someone that was gay, but not everyone knows someone that's a drag queen or trans. And so therefore it's an easier issue, and it's the wedge issue that they can get in there to start making some changes. And it's therefore this reaction that they need to have this enemy is not the right word, but they need to have this objective to somehow turn back the clock on rights to LGBTQ plus people. What do you think of that? Is that what it is? It's people that, you know, they're frustrated, they've lost the battle on gay marriage, and so therefore they want to win the war on something else?
Absolutely, and it's part of a broader slate of bills, really. Some that attack women's, you know, rights over their own body in the States, as well as trans rights, and of course, drag queens reading children's stories. Who would ever have thought? This is not unprecedented. I mean, you know, not to go over the top on this, but there's a wonderful Netflix documentary on Berlin in the 1930s, before the Nazi rise to power. And it was one of the most queer positive cities in Europe. They had, in fact, a gender institute that performed a sex reassignment surgery. They had dozens of queer clubs. I mean, Cabaret, if you've ever seen that, I'm sure most people have. It's kind of an indication of how open and fluid it was. And some of the first people that the Nazis focused on were drag queens and trans folk back then, as well as people with disabilities. So they were the first. And so we've seen this movie before. It doesn't end well. And I think that this is definitely from the right, and not just, you know, the conservative. I wouldn't grace it with the word conservative. I think it's a Republican right, and far right Republicans even, that have really picked on. And it's, you know, Brian, actually what it is sad, because trans folk are the ones most at risk of suicide. Trans folk, the average trans person is living in poverty. About 50% of them live below the poverty mark, because it's difficult to get work, especially in the United States. In fact, there is a movement to try to declare, the government already has in a sense, that it's not safe for trans folk or queer people to travel to the United States now. And we're hoping that they will be able to get refugee status, because they really are at risk in most of those states now. They're at risk of violence, and they're certainly at risk of hatred, and they have laws being passed against them. So that calls, I think, for a response from our government, our federal government. But I mean, as children go, I mean, you can imagine, you know, what it's like to grow up even gay or lesbian in schools, never mind trans. These are students, they're children that are bullied, that are harassed often. And, you know, a march walking down the main street of your town that's targeting you when you're a little kid is not the way we want to see, I think, our children treated. So I think it's just sad. It shows a lack of compassion and love, and most of all, a real lack of education and understanding about the issue.
You're a minister in the United Church. You're a person of the cloth of God. Most of the people that are on the right that are objecting to gay rights or trans rights quote biblical passages and think that they're doing, or at least say that they think they're doing what God wants. Why is that? Where's this?
Well, you know, if you proof text is what it's called. If you take a line out of a document and you don't look at the rest of the lines around that line, You can prove just about anything you want from the Bible. Remember, Paul defends slavery in the Bible. Paul also says, don't get married. They thought essentially the second coming of Jesus was coming imminently at that time. So don't make any changes, is basically what he was saying. In the New Testament, in Leviticus, there are over 600 different laws. One of them says, men lying with men should be put to death. They also say don't eat shellfish. They said don't wear clothes that are of mixed fabrics. There's 600 laws, virtually none of which we pay attention to these days. In fact, if you did, you would be arrested, like sacrificing animals on your front lawn and sending women out into the backyard when they have their periods. I mean, come on. So you can't just take a line out here or there out of context to prove what you need you're trying to prove. Of course, did that with Matthew 19:12. But all I'm saying is that I used to hear that Jesus said nothing about homosexuality. And then I found this little line and said, well, actually, he says something positive. So, I mean, really, what is the scope of all of our faiths? All of our faiths is the golden rule, is to love your neighbor as yourself. And in none of our faiths does it say, qualify which neighbor, only this neighbor, not that neighbor. No, it's called love your neighbor as yourself. And that should extend to everyone, particularly the vulnerable. And the Bible is full of the vulnerable, the marginalized, being the children of God, being the ones that God looks to, including Jesus, so this is our Abrahamic tradition, but it's also all faiths tradition.
But as well as I, that there are a whole bunch of pastors, preachers, evangelical ministers on the right that quote the Bible and use it as a basis for being against abortion, against a woman's right to choose, against gay marriage, against trans, etc. And they're attracting a fair following and trying to create these million-person marches because of it, and changing ballot initiatives across the United States for that.
And so, and it's built on a great lie. For example, there's not one word against abortion in the Bible, not one. So there's a fact for you. This is not built. Their movement is not built on scholarship. Their movement is built on right-wing ideology that's using religion as a cover. This has been done before throughout history, and it's being done again. They are not speaking as Christians. They're not speaking loving and compassionately about their neighbors. They're not supporting the vulnerable or the marginalized. No, they're speaking, usually supported, as are those state legislators, through a lot of money. Who pay them and who donate to their campaigns. So let's look at where these attitudes are coming from and who's supporting them and paying for them. So there's that. And it's very, very sad. I mean, it's sad for people of faith. The United Church of Canada is Canada's largest Protestant denomination still. And in 1988, the reason I walked into the United Church is that they ordained openly gay and lesbian folk. They didn't ask them to be celibate. So that was a very brave move, a very Canadian move, I'd like to say. And that's why I and many others walked into the church. I wouldn't have had my children raised in a children's church or a Sunday school where they taught them to dislike or hate their neighbors because they were different. And the same movement that targets this also is allied with white supremacy and all sorts of very noxious movements, anti-Semitism. We're seeing the rise of all of this. We're seeing the rise south of the border, and we're seeing the rise north of the border. And I think it's really time that people who are people of faith showed their faith. It will cost, like it did in Germany, for real Christians to be really Christian. Many of them were killed and also put in concentration camps in what was called then the Confessing Church. And the same may happen again. And this is the time we show our faith, all of our people of faith. Just today in my church, we had a Yom Kippur being celebrated by an inclusive Jewish congregation that used our sanctuary for their celebration because there wasn't room for them at the Jewish Community Center near us. Last Sunday, we had our multi-faith service. We invited Fareen Khan, the founder of the Women's Mosque in Canada, to come and preach. Again, an inclusive mosque. So there's lots of opportunity to find a religious outlet. In fact, it's easier, I would argue, to find a religious outlet that will love you and accept you than it is to find one in Canada that hates you just because of who you are. And we want that aspect of our faith to grow. So it's not, I dismiss the fact that this is a Christian response or a Muslim response or a Sikh response or a Jewish response. This is a response of a right-wing ideology. We've seen it before in history, and we're seeing it again.
I grew up in the United Church. My brother was a minister in the United Church. I, was in youth group and went to church camp and was on the worship committee and all that kind of stuff. But in business and in society, I don't talk about that a lot because I think that sometimes I'm embarrassed because I think that some evangelical right-wing people have given Christianity a bad name when they focus on abortion and on anti-gay rights and anti-trans rights. And I worry that, you talk about the United Church being the biggest Protestant religion. Some people call the United Church a community club rather than a church because it's so open. What's happened?
Well, I mean, first of all, this still is. I mean, this is just numerical. I mean, are we losing members? Yes, as is every religious denomination, just about. Some are growing. They're growing because of immigration. More Muslims are coming, more Sikhs are coming to Canada, so you'll see a growth in those religions. But overall, the younger generation are staying away from churches. They're staying away from mosques, and they're staying away from temples. They're staying away from synagogues. So we're very lucky at our church that that's our growing edge, or 20-somethings that are coming in. And it's because of our inclusion. It's because of our, affirming of everyone that they're coming in. So I would argue that you can grow a church. In fact, my doctoral thesis was on this topic called Queering Evangelism, because the church where I performed the first legalized same-sex marriage, when I first went there, was supposed to close in 2 years. Well, guess what? It's still open. And by the time I left there in 2006, when I was elected, there were 1,000 people attending Christmas Eve services in that church, and there still probably are. I proved, and many have, that you can grow a church. You can grow anything by being inclusive and welcoming and compassionate. Kind of makes sense when you think about it, and not exclusionary. So certainly, yes, overall religion, we're becoming increasingly secular, and that's fine. But I speak about this all the time. I speak about it to religious groups. I speak about it to pride, festivals and pride groups. And Saturday I was in Napanee speaking to their Pride Summit. There were many conservatives in the room, and we taught chapter and verse as well. And we also talked about rights and laws. I think that's what makes us Canadian. I hope that's what makes us different from the United States, quite frankly, is that we have human rights and we take them seriously and we support them. And I look with a bit of terror, actually, at what's happening in some of the states. But I still, on Zoom, speak to some of the classes in Texas. I've been asked to speak to classes in Texas who are in seminaries. I've been talking to seminaries about both of my books, actually, in the United States. So clearly there are still seminaries and professors teaching inclusion, which gives me hope.
So you don't think I should be embarrassed to be a church-going Christian?
Not at all. In fact, I'm overjoyed to identify as a Christian. I don't have my collar on tonight, and I just realized as we got on air that I didn't put it on. But I wear my collar to the demonstrations that I go to. Identify very clearly as Christian clergy, especially if the demonstrations around LGBTQ rights, March and Pride and Dyke Day and Trans March, wearing my collar. I'm very out and very proud about it, and very happy to speak about it to anyone. And that's a great gift, I think.
We're chatting tonight with Dr. Reverend Cheri DiNovo about trans rights and the forces against trans rights and the forces for trans rights in this big march that took place last week with people on both sides. We're going to take a break and come back with Dr. Cheri DiNovo in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I wanted to have the Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo on our show because last week there was this big march for people that were against trans rights and wanting to have an obligation for teachers to inform parents if the kids expressed any sense that they might be trans. And I actually had an interesting conversation with the former Minister of Education from New Brunswick, who quit the Conservative caucus in New Brunswick about this topic. And he said that he thought this was close to assault, that it was or abuse, that it was something that kids had the right to be able to ask mentors and teachers and guidance counselors and ministers and things like that for help, and not be forced to inform their parents. If they didn't want to. And yet there's a lot of people that think that, I guess, parents can tell the kids what to do, and that the parents had not only the right but the responsibility to get involved. And so this was an interesting topic, and I think it was interesting that even though the group organizing the march said there were going to be 1 million people, all the reports said there were actually more people that marched in the counter protests against that. The Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo is someone who's been a very out there, articulate, passionate advocate for LGBTQ rights. And so I thought it'd be interesting to talk to her. Dr. DiNovo, I interviewed someone that was of Métis Indian, a native descent, and we were talking about this, and she said, well, that the two-spirit that some people add to the whole LGBTQ plus I don't know what you call it name, were the people that were most revered. They were the doctors. They were the medicine men. They were the people that were thought of as the seers, the smart people, and they were the people that were trans. And she went on to explain that there's been trans people throughout history, just like some people have said there's gay people throughout history. And so therefore this current opposition that you see is a little bit silly. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely. I mean, two-spirited people have always been with us in Indigenous cultures around the world. So have trans people, so have queer people, LGBTQ 2+, all of those have been with us since humans were humans. And one of the things that I said when I spoke to the march, just to remind them of what's happened in our history, is because I'm old. And so in 1971, the first gay demonstration was at Parliament Hill, and I was part of that. And, talking about children, I was pretty much a child then myself. And, we were utopian, we thought. We were asking for things like equal marriage. We were asking things like, we don't want to lose our job and be fired because we're out. We don't want to lose our housing because we're out. We want, if we're married and have children, to be able to see our children or keep our children if we're out. All of those were not possible at that time. And guess what? We won them all. In 2001, I did the first legalized same-sex marriage in Canada. And shortly after that, it spread across Canada. And guess what? We won that too. And in 2012, when I was elected, that's when, after 6 years of trying, we finally got trans rights into the Ontario Human Rights Code. Again, that spread across Canada. The federal government picked it up. We won that. We won banning conversion therapy, 2015. We won parent equality, 2016. We won the Trans Day of Remembrance in 2017. So I'm not doomerist about this at all. We won every single effort that we made in the 2S LGBTQ plus community. And every one of them was about saving lives. Every one of them was about the safety of our children. And so our children are safer than they once were, as are our adults safer. The Queer Evangelist, my book is a story a bit about me growing up. I'm a Torontonian, born and bred, one of the few. I've only lived in New York. It's the only city I've lived in other than Toronto. And I left home at 15. I lived on the streets of Toronto as a 15-year-old. I looked like I was 12 because I had, my home was violent and it was not queer accepting. And children are still doing that. And so often when I'm speaking to high schools, or I did as an elected representative, I know I'm speaking to children who are having a really hard time at home. And luckily in those days, I got off the streets because you could live on social assistance back then, got back to university, got back to school, etc. Got into business and then into church and then into politics. So I've had several careers. And quite frankly, I survived. And I survived through the help and the assistance of adults who were willing to be compassionate and inclusive. And so everything I think I've done for the queer and with the queer community has been about that, has been about saving children's lives. So it really hit home when the other side, people who are willing to put children's lives at risk, came out and pretended that they weren't, pretended that they were marching for children. We've seen, again, that before. So I would just really caution folk to educate oneself about these issues. And again, I come back to the same situation. I mean, if you're straight and this is all strange to you and trans is strange to you, I would say, would you like your teachers outing you for buying condoms or going to a doctor for birth control as a teenager? Would you like your teachers outing you to your parent if you're gay or lesbian? Because one of the things this movement is trying to do now, because they know they've lost, as you said, quite rightly, they've lost the other fights. They're trying to divide our movement, and they're trying to pitch the LGBs against the Qs and the Ts. I mean, this is nonsense, and they must know it, because what's happening to trans folk today, this same group of people is going to come after them tomorrow.
Why did you leave the church and get into politics?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I never chose to. I mean, it never dawned on me that I would want to go into politics. When I did the first legalized same-sex marriage, and I also grew the church, the party, the NDP, came and asked me if I would run. And they knew I was a social justice activist pretty clearly from what I'd done. It got a lot of press. The church, by the way, didn't help. The government at that day, conservative government, threatened to take away my license. So it became very public. It was debated actually in the House, which I didn't know at the time. And so I ended up getting the Doug Elliott, who was the lawyer who was closely associated with trying to make legal marriage legal, for same-sex couples. And the CBC covered it a lot. So I had a lot of press, a lot of following, and a base. So you can see why a political party would ask me to run, because name recognition, right? And it took me about 3 months to say yes, and I said yes because I thought maybe I could affect the issues that I care deeply about from one of those green leather chairs at Queen's Park more than I could from the pulpit. But I had some very good advice. There were two men named Victor. They gave me two pieces of advice. One was, if you're asked by a political party to run, it's like being asked by the quarterback to the high school formal. It's flattering, but then you have to spend the evening with a football player, which I thought was excellent advice and proved true. And the other piece of advice was from another man named Victor in our congregation, who said, Cheri, he said, I wouldn't wish that job on my worst enemy, but I think you should run. So both of those pieces of advice turned out to be true.
It was that bad in the legislature?
Well, let's put it, I don't want to complain. I mean, it's such a privilege to be elected to public office. And I don't take that lightly. And truly, we got so much done, not just around queer rights. I mean, the first PTSD coverage for first responders, that was my bill. I mean, I got lots of other bills done. In fact, declaring the Holodomor, which is on everybody's mind these days as a genocide, that was a first tri-party bill, which I was part of. So I did lots of other things too in that role and got a lot done. And I don't regret a minute of it. But certainly it's 24/7, as any politician will tell you. And certainly you get very used to the detractors in your life, especially now in the days of social media. And so it's not easy. It's really not easy, but it's worth it. I definitely advise people when they come to me and they say, what do you think? Should I run? And almost always I say yes, because even if you lose, you have a chance to speak. You have a chance to get some coverage about the issues that you care about. And if you're someone who's a reformer or somebody who wants to see things change, then you should, absolutely. So no, I don't regret it at all. But I do laugh thinking back on it because there was some truth to their opinions.
And you're back to being a minister now?
Yes. In 2017, I for 4 terms, 4 elections that I won, I just thought I've probably done what I can do here. It's time really to move on. And I miss ministry. I love ministry. It's doesn't pay as well, it's not as heralded, but it's I always say it's the best job in the world. I love wrestling with scripture. I like preaching, but I also like marrying people. I particularly love to walk with people through the hard times, like funerals and the losses, and I love the life of prayer. So to me, this is a wonderful life. Doesn't pay as well, but it's a wonderful life. And yeah, and so when people ask me about going into seminary, I always say yes, do it. It's right on Bloor Street near Spadina. It's called Trinity St. Paul's Center for Faith, Justice, and the Arts, because we're really a community hub. We are a church, but we are also a concert hall. Taffel Music and Toronto Concert it's their home too. And so we do a lot of things. We run a lot of things. And as I said, today there was a Yom Kippur celebration in our sanctuary, which I was very proud to have welcomed.
I've been to beautiful opera performances in your sanctuary.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's a wonderful place, a wonderful hub for all sorts of things that are progressive and lovely and artistic,
Tell me
as well as faithful.
Tell me about your 2 books, please.
Yeah, so the first book was my doctoral thesis, and it was published out of UCLA. It was done here in Toronto through our School of Theology here, through Emmanuel and U of T, but published out of UCLA, and it was called Queering Evangelism and How to Grow a Church from the Outside In, was the byline. And it was basically based on my experience of growing a church in a way that people didn't think was possible, by inviting those with no money, inviting those who are LGBTQ in, street involved, by inviting them into the church, having a service for them, in fact, grows the church. We had 2 services every Sunday in that church. So it's about that experience, and it's about the theology and the philosophy behind it. And then, and that won the Lambda in Washington, D.C. For spirituality and religion in 2005. So a while back, but still a precious moment. And then this one came out just a year and a half ago, about 2 years ago now, The Queer Evangelist, which is really my memoir and just a story of my life. So I've kind of lived through a lot, and it's kind of a sign of the times. So I think people seem to like it. It's an easy read. You can get it anywhere. But I always say, please, 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 go to your local bookstore and support them. They really need your support. I know you can get it from Amazon, but it's nice to walk into a bookstore and actually, if they don't have it, they will order it. And I particularly plug Glad Day, which is in the Village on Church Street. So they're a kind of co-op, and they've really been there for the queer community for decades and decades. So they have copies.
It'd be interesting to read about your story and hear your story, because I think that understanding some people's real lived experiences, I think, is really helpful to have empathy for people and experience through someone else's story what the life might be like. I interviewed a Baptist minister from Clarkson, South Mississauga, who came out as trans and lost her job and ended up going through really quite a traumatic experience where people that she thought were some of her biggest supporters turned out to not be so.
Junia Joplin, she's a friend. I know her quite well.
It was really quite an impactful interview. So I look forward to hearing your story. And what I'd like, if it's all right, is after the break, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my own family story, and because I think that it's an important thing that we need to talk about, because I do think that people will become a little bit more understanding and hopefully more supportive of people that are different. That, as you said in Matthew, Jesus said, we're just born that way. We're going to take a break and come back in just 2 minutes with Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo. We're talking about LGBTQ plus Two-Spirit trans rights right now. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is the Reverend Dr. Cheri DiNovo. She's a minister in the United Church. She's a former member of provincial parliament. She's written the book, The Queer Evangelist. She was a speaker at the counter protest to this big march that occurred last week in regards to sort of anti-trans rights, or the responsibility they were trying to get. The teachers had to out trans people. I want to tell you a little bit about my own family story, if I could, for a minute, just because I think it's kind of instructive as to how people need support. My ex-wife and myself were very supportive of gay rights. My brother is gay. My best friend is gay. He passed away, so was gay, I guess I should say. I thought we were very progressive and made it obvious that we were progressive. My son, however, was fearful of telling us that he was gay, and didn't for the longest time. He went off to a camp where it turned out it was a far-right camp that tried to get him to pray the gay out of him, and that was a pretty traumatic experience for him. And when he finally came out to me, it was after quite a lot of soul searching, and I was shocked and surprised that he found it so difficult. And around the similar time, I had a friend that was a very good friend since college days that resisted coming out for the longest time, and then finally came out. And then I was marching in the Pride Parade with parents. I think it's called PFLAG, Parents for Lesbian and Gay People. And I held up a sign, I'm proud of my gay son. My son came up to me and cried and said, "Dad, it means so much to me to have you, not just privately, but publicly, say that you're actually proud of me." And so I guess what I was trying to say to you is, I thought I was progressive. I thought I was accepting. I thought I was obvious to everyone that I was, but for some reason, he was nervous. It's, I think, difficult and challenging for people in our society to come out as queer.
Absolutely. And that is why they need such support from anyone that they disclose that to, and why they need such love and such protection, clearly, now too. And our laws give them that, thank goodness. But I mean, it's about living the law as well. It's about making sure that people know the law and making sure they know why those laws are there to protect them. Because it is difficult, and it's difficult enough to be a teenager. We all were one once, never mind being different and trying to, and every teenager still, I talk to young people a lot in my congregation, and it's still difficult for them to come out. Although I do have one funny story, and that is that this one young woman has very progressive parents like you, Brian, and she said, it was harder. She's identifies as lesbian, and she said it was harder to come out as Christian to my progressive left-leaning parents than it was to come out as lesbian, which I thought was pretty funny. Times have changed, but I hope that her story is. I know it's not the norm, sadly, but I mean there are many that is not their norm, and so really we counter protested for them.
So, if I'm Christian or not, but if I'm someone that strongly believes that we need to have a more accepting society, a more supportive, not accepting, but more supportive society, what do we do?
We continue to speak out. We continue to be good allies. We continue to obey, to uphold our laws, which are good ones, and our human rights codes, which are good, and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is good. We continue to do all of those good things. And if we're members of faith communities, we uphold the essence of our faith, which is to love our neighbor and not to judge. Do not judge. Judge not, said Jesus. So that should be enough to let people know that they're not God, and that they should just love. So, and particularly children. I mean, please, children, because I felt so sorry for those parents, and I felt sorry for, in the bills that I passed, so many people that came and testified against those bills. I felt sorry for their children in case they turned out like you, Brian, in case their children came out. And many of these parents reject their children. I can't even imagine that. Like, would you really want to live your life without your children? People do, over an ideology that simply is not informed. So let's educate ourselves and others.
Dr. Reverend Cheri DiNovo, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think that, particularly on AM radio, maybe the other side of this issue get too much airtime. And so I think it was really helpful to have you on, and I really appreciate you chatting with us. I've had the pleasure of interviewing Douglas Elliott, who's a real supporter, I guess, of yours and of gay rights and women's right to choose and human rights, etc. And as you mentioned, this pastor that had the harrowing experience of coming out as trans and being fired by her congregation and losing a lot of support and friends and having to pick up her life. And those are just a few examples of some of the inspirational people in our community. So thank you very much for being one of them as well.
Yes, well, it was an honor. Thank you. Thanks, Brian.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from downtown Toronto, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videocasts are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure meeting you sort of in person. Good night, everybody.
Bye, Brian.